Hi guys, welcome to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the React context. What is React context? React context provides a way to pass data through component tree without having to pass props down manually at each level. Right? It sounds a bit too much, right? With too much words going out in there and all that, right? But usually this is how I think about React context. So say for example you go and visit your grandmother or your grandfather, right? And they want to give you a gift, so probably like money or um anything of that sort, right? They hand it over to you directly without having to give it to your mother, your father before it gets passed down to you, right? Yeah, so that's how context behaves. So you can directly pass data or whatever it is, states, whatever, to the children of other components, right? And one simple use case is list, right? You can have a list inside a list, inside a list, inside another list, right? And you want the children to have data of the top parent, right? And you passing that data down as prop is going to be a lot of tedious work, right? So you just use the context, skip all the children that does not need that state, and then just access it from the children or the component that actually needs it, right? Another way you can also think about it is context makes your code looks quite clean and very professional in a way. Cool. So now let's dive into how to use the React context. Okay, so here I have a simple app where someone can sign in and then see their roles and privileges. Pretty simple application, and they can clear out. That means they are logged out. Pretty simple. So this is the code for the app. So we have an auth form, so where the user can sign in, and you have the user info view where it will show the roles and privileges for that particular user. And if the person is not logged in, it will just show the user is not logged in text. Let's dive a little bit deep into each of these components. Right, so we have the auth form over here, which is basically just a form with a simple input field and a button, two buttons actually. But the clear out button doesn't show until the user has logged in. That means we actually do have a user in the system. And let's look at the user info view. So it renders a simple table in which we are passing the user object into another component called the table body, where it will render out the various access rules that the user has onto the page. So now, how do we use context in this particular scenario? What is the benefit that context is going to give us in this case? So one of the very first thing that you probably notice is that context will help us eliminate the passing of the user object from one component to another, especially in the user info view. So you're passing the user object over here, and we are passing it down here, so we're accessing it over here, and then we are then passing it onwards to another component called the table body, and it renders the rules over there. Same thing too, it will also eliminate the usage of this or passing the user object to the auth form here, right? So we won't have to actually pass user object throughout the entire application. Okay? So now let's actually see how it's being done. So first we need to bring in the create context from the React library, right? So we're going to create a context. So let's say user context. So create context. And since I'm using TypeScript, so it's requiring some types. So I'm just going to bring in an empty object, right? And then the user context, we need to wrap the components that is going to use the values that's in that context, right? So we need to place it in the app because we want all the children under the app to utilize or use any states that or any values that's inside the user context. And to do that, we need to pass that here, and we need a provider, right? So what is the provider? So a provider is simply the component or the wrapper that provides all the values to all the children that utilizes the user context. So it just provides data to anyone that needs it. So now we need a prop over here, property called value. So value is actually the data that we are going to send throughout all the components that needs it. Okay. And what data are we going to be sending around for other components to use, right? We are going to be sending the user object, which is the user info. So this is the data that we are going to be sending throughout our application. All right. So, and since we are using TypeScript, we actually need to define the types properly over in the context so that we can't properly use it around. So we have since we already created the type for the user info object, we can just pass it over here. Oops. And it's saying that the user info can be undefined as well, which is actually true. So it can be defined. We have that. Now, furthermore, we actually need to define the default states of the context value, right? So in this case, we are going to have the user object being undefined. Now, how are we going to access the data inside the user context? To do that, we need a hook from React, or the use context. So use context is going to help us to access the data or whatever values that has been placed inside the context in React. And we need to pass in the particular context in order to access this data. In this case, it's going to be the user context. Very simple. Okay, so let's see, we can have context. Oops. Right. And with the power of TypeScript, it can actually tell us that the data that we actually have inside this particular context, in this case, is user. And it's simply an object, right? So you can do object destructuring, get rid of that, and pass in the user. And since you have a duplicate over here, you can get rid of this, get rid of that. And over here, you can then get rid of this. And now we are not passing in the user objects to the off form anymore. We're going to use the use context. We're going to get the user object from the context, the user context. Same can be done for the other components, right? So use the user info view. You can use the context over there. Then we can get rid of the entire object that we have, the entire props, since it's just only making use of what the user object. And we have an issue right now that we need to fix. It's saying that the object is possibly undefined. So you can simply just check. So if there is no user, we can simply just return null. And we don't have to worry ourselves about that anymore. Right. Then moving on to the table body, same can be done. Let's copy this over here. We pass in the context. Right. We pass in the context. We do the same. We get rid of all the props that has been passed to it because it's just using only one prop. We get rid of this. And then we perform the same check again. So if there is no user object, we simply just return nothing. Right? Cool. Now we need to get rid of the user object, the info object over here, the user prop. Now we have a pretty clean component. Right? We are not passing in props all over the place anymore. Right? It can stand on its own. And another beautiful thing that you can actually probably pick up on it is that because we are performing these condition checks inside the components themselves, we don't have to explicitly check the user check for the user info anymore. You can simply just paste it over here and it'll work as it should. But probably in the second case where we actually need to show this in case the user info object isn't available, create a simple component, empty user. Right? We grab the context over here. We check if there is actually a user object, then actually return null. But if not, oops, return this. So you can have this. Pretty simple kind of thing, but if you are not quite versed in understanding what's going on inside this component, this can get pretty confusing at the start, because you need to check what empty user is actually doing. Right? But this is just kind of like a neat way that you can actually go about, performing some kind of conditions inside each component themselves. Then we save that. Then we'll go back and actually check if everything's working. Yes, everything works as it should. We show the edit, view, delete, add, whatever. You can clear out and all that. So that's one way we can use the context by passing in actual data. What about functions or events that you actually want to perform deep down in other components, right? How are you going to do that? We can actually apply the same logic in this case. So you can pass in a user change property. So which is the user, the user info set states that we have over here, right? We need to also define this inside React, inside the context. So a simple default function that returns null. We can then utilize that function over here on user change. Now we can get rid of everything over here. So this one was renamed to handle user change, so we can rename the onChange user here. Then we can get rid of the props over here. We save that, then try it again. Then everything works out just as it is. But this is a pretty simple and clean way of using the context API from React. So it helps and clean up your code quite a bit, and also helps avoid passing in props deep down to other components, passing it from one level to another, one child to another child to another child before accessing whatever they are. You can skip all that just using the context API over here. One thing I should also mention is that usually, if in terms of condition, don't do this, right? This is just a simple, way that you can actually show some clean code. Right? Usually, I don't do it. Just use the conditional statement for these two, so that anybody who comes into the app will understand what is going on here. Or better yet, maybe you do not even want to do this, right? You do not want to have this whole component here. You can simply just do this. We're going to grab this whole code over here and then bring it here. Right. So if there is no user objects, we can actually show the user isn't logged in. Then we can clear out the entire component. Going back into the app, then everything works as it should. The next question that probably might ask yourself is, when should I use the React context, right? And usually you use the React context for states that do not change that often, of data that do not change that often. For example, the user login. So when a user login in a case like this, they probably won't change their authentication again to get another person's data or something like that. No, usually I don't do that. Right? So for states that don't change over time, you can use context for that. And also you can use the context in scenarios where you do not want to pass props deep down to other components, right? So probably you have 3 levels deep of React components that is being passed props all over the place. You can eliminate all that and then use the context. That's, just as we use for the table body and the user info view that we have over here. There's one child and there's the child of that child, right? And then we can skip all that. This can access the data. This can also access the data if it wishes. And other components, even 3 levels or 100 levels deep, it can actually access the data. Probably in this case right here, you can access the data if you want a span or any components deep level to do other stuff. So now we're going to look at testing the React context, right? Components that utilizes the React context. So in this case, I'm going to test the table body because that's a pretty good example of a test case. So let's import the table body. So now we need to render the table body to the document. So let's pass in this. So we are rendering the table body. Now the test, we want to actually see the roles of the person, right? And so let's say, for example, the user that we're using, in this case right here. So we have a simple function in which is just going to have an object of the registered usernames in the system and show their return their roles and privileges and show them inside the system, somewhere like on the document, right? So let's say, for example, you actually want to see, so you want to see the role of administrator, right? You want to see the role of administrator. So we look at the screen, so you get by text. They are going to look for administrator, right? Expect it to be in the document. All right. So now let's test this case and see what happens. And as you can see, it fails, right? It fails because it couldn't find the administrator in the document anywhere. Couldn't find it, right? Because the administrator or the user object only exists inside the context, right? And right now we don't have a wraparound, we don't have a provider for the set context. Right? So to provide that context, we need to actually wrap the table body inside the provider component, right? In this case, this context. Right? So let's export this context. So we're going to grab that. So user context. Then we need to wrap this inside the user context dot provider and pass in the values that we are looking for. Right? So in this case, we have the user. So let's actually grab this particular user. In this case, we are going to use this function that we've already written over here of get roles and privileges. And so we're going to have the user being this guy. So we need to import that over from our app, then pass in the particular user that we are looking for. So we have the user. Then we need the onChange function, right? In this case, we are not really going to be dealing with the onChange function, so we are just going to use the JSBox function. I made an error. So this one is only providing us with the roles and privileges. We actually need the user object. So we have the username being this guy, Timothy. Then we have the access roles being, let's change the name over here, change it to roles. We have roles. Better here, we can just rename this to, so I don't have to just all over the place. So we save that, and now the test passes. Right? Yeah. So now we are providing the table body with the values that it needs in order to show the roles and privileges inside the document, right? But what about components that actually creates or provides the other components with a context? In this case, the app component, right? It provides other components with the context that it needs. So we're going to have another test suite just for the app. Let me quickly add this. So we're going to have a test. So we want to show user. So we want to show the user in the app. Right? So in this case, we are actually going to render out the app component. But in this case, we do not have to wrap it inside a provider because it already contains the provider inside it, right, with its own state and everything. So that's all that you need to do for components that actually creates or provides the provider, the context. But then onwards, we need to actually do some real test case, right? Now to actually perform some simple test case, we actually want to see the user's privileges or roles or whatever inside the documents when you actually log in, right? To do that, we are going to use the user event library. And we are going to type into the get by label text. and the label text is simply the username. So you're going to type into the username field, and then we actually want to await and see that this the roles or privileges concerning this particular user actually shows up in the document, right? And to do that, we can use the screen.find by text. Then simply just use this. So we want to see that the administrator is shown onto the page. Then since we are using the await keyword, we need to make this function asynchronous function. We actually forgot to submit the form. So user event dot click. So we need to actually submit the form. So get by row button. Yeah, now it passes, right? So once we've entered the username, we actually need to hit the button in order to submit it for the person to be logged in and then show his roles and privileges. So that's all I want to talk about for the Context API. It's a simple guide to the Context API. You can read more about the Context API on the React Docs website. We provide a ton of information about the context. You can read it all. So that's all for this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Thanks very much.